So I'd like you to ignore the name. Have a seat. I'd like you to ignore the name of this session. I have now renamed it the software of systems change. There's absolutely no reason why we need two men up here talking about hardware. Indy, Ecmel. I'm not going to introduce you again. You have the bios. You can read yourself. We're going to move in straight into the kind of work you do. And I'm going to ask you first what your take is on systems change, but I'd like you to use the lens of the conversation we've just had and the power of story in doing that. Yeah. So Ecmel, why don't you go ahead, our local guest. You tell us a little bit about your take on that, but please work in your who you are and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Actually, I'm an academic in Am I being heard?
Yeah. You're on.
Yeah.
Is he on? Yeah.
I'm an academic in organization theory, and so I am part of Istanbul Bilgi University. I'm in the management of that institution. And when I hear the word system and systems changing, I think a system is, perceived as a total of moving parts, which are moving independently of each other. And when you make a systemic analysis, you just focus on those elements. But rather, and when you do that, you expect them to, interact with, amongst each other in a rational way, in a linear way, right? So you can expect what's going to happen when they collide each other. But life really doesn't flow like that. So when I make a systemic analysis, I think I fall in love with the unpredictability of those elements when they interact with each other. So this volatility and ambiguity is not a threat, but it brings a hope. Because when you look at the outcome of any interaction, you can detect that some small parts, just like this little tiny girl, can make an impact so large that you could not imagine before it happened. So I think this unpredictability and volatility of interactions is very critical. And when they interact with each other, we also, as a habit, after the Enlightenment, I would say, the modern mind or the non-existing Homo economicus part of us is expecting a rational interaction. And on the other hand, just Leonardo asked us whether we are deciding with our minds or hearts. So we almost believe that there is a line between rational and irrational, and these are the two ends of one dimension. I think we can also change that, because there is another level where most of the time we operate in that level, which is the surrational level. I came up with this word almost like 10 years ago. Actually, I was the one who decided to use it for this purpose. So the story is the cord which links these two edges, and when you play with the story, they collide and they become one. So we connect in a surrational way, and I think this would make all the difference. Story is what we need to create this surrational environment, and whatever I did in my life, I have tried to operate in that sphere. So I think that's about it. Thank you. Thank you.
Our challenge is how we use this terminology, or how we communicate this new word in a effective way that people understand. It's my fault. I asked him to say that. Yeah. Indy.
Thank you. So I would say one of the interesting things about, and I really appreciate the first panel, the previous panel, because I think in order to do system change, I'd say there's two key things. How do you shift people's dreams, and how do you shift people's dark matter? And what I mean by dreams is the first interracial kiss on American TV happened on Star Trek. Right? It was 1968. This was the time, actually, about 6 months after Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. So the shifting of dreams is actually a fundamentally powerful thing. And I think one of the key questions is, what's our big dreams? And I would argue that one of the big challenges we face is we've lost the ability to dream. And to quote another film, Interstellar, which I think I'd recommend everyone here watch. Interstellar is a great film, great quote where he says, we argue for our place in the dirt as opposed to dream of our place in the stars. And I think increasingly the political and innovation debate is about the division of the now rather than the creation of infinite possibilities that exist at our table. So what is the equivalent of going to Mars for social innovation? What is the equivalent of traveling far? And I think shifting that debate and the dreams of today is fundamental. And on the other side, I think shifting the dark matter. What do I mean by that? So in the UK, if you're a youth offender, it costs £238,000 a year to put someone in youth offending prison. £238,000. It costs £60,000 to put them in Eton. It costs £65,000, $65,000 to put them in Yale. We spend factorful more putting people into youth detention than we do in the best of environments. Now, the accounting behind that is interesting. And that's where stuff like social impact bonds are really important, because what they've changed is the accounting infrastructure. They're not about social innovation, they're about innovating accounting. And that's fundamental to allowing a whole class of technologies and ways of driving change. Other things, Gibson, a town in Canada, has put an aquifer on the balance sheet of a local authority. That fundamentally changes how you can do preventative investment into preserving natural asset environmental services. So what is the accounting infrastructure of tomorrow, I think is also going to be fundamental, whether it's accounting or governance. So one of the big failures that we see around us is a fundamental failure of governance. The world isn't going wrong just for the sake of it. It's because actually the way we operate and our governance methods are out of time. We live in a network world, yet we govern like we live in an Enlightenment silo-driven world. We haven't built a governance architecture for the 21st century. But all these things are actually in process of change. I won't mention the dreaded B word, blockchain, but blockchain is the beginning of a poem of the next 20 years of thinking of how we talk about linked value, linked infrastructures. Smart contracts, smart policy, they're going to create the architecture for actually massive interlocking behaviors, able to reimagine governance for the 21st century. What does regulation look like when it's actually made out of code? How do you build civic legitimacy into that is all fundamental questions. So what I would say is, how do we dream massively big? How do we do the dark matter? And then the final point is actually reimagining what it means to be human. So what I would say is, if you look at the science of being human, it's far and away more interesting than our social policy, right? So if you are poor, your IQ levels drop by 13 points. If you live in a poor household. If you live in a stressful household, you cannot absorb nutrition. Your neuroscience of your friends affects you. Epigenetics means that actually poverty transmits 2 generations down the line. What does social justice mean in that world? What does equality mean in that world when we know this is fundamentally interlinked? Reimagining what it means to be human and thereby reimagining what justice really means is a foundation step. And the reason why we're getting a large scale of civic movements around the world is because fundamentally our reconception of being human is on the table. And I think between these 3 things, I think we can genuinely dream for the stars for social innovation.
Thank you, Indy. So very inspiring. How do you do that then?
Do you want to go?
Yes.
Lots of things. Accounting.
You can do a couple of things and then I'll go to Ecmel.
Yeah, I think accounting, right. Accounting is really up for grabs. How do you amortize future healthcare costs, future preventive? Those things are all on the table right now. Gibson has already proved natural assets accounting. How do we bring that onto public balance sheets? All the kind of smart policy stuff around how do we build smart policy which is civically legible? That will change some of this stuff. How do we invest equivalently in governance as we do in startups? I think is fundamentally another key question. So I think these things are already happening. And the other thing I would love to see a lot more is investing in science fiction, right? What would science fiction look like in Istanbul? We saw what Black Panther did. I would love to see Istanbul science fiction challenging what 2200 will look like in Istanbul when we have big, bold dreams. And I think those are real things that we can all do, but they're about infecting viruses into people's brains and imagining a radically better world where actually there's infinite possibility on the table.
So Ecmel, thanks Indy. Ecmel, the same question, how do we practically do this? These are all really important questions, but how do we do this? And you and I yesterday when we were talking, talked a lot about essence, and we talked about communities and building and the work that you do in the university, like in keeping that essence and the values that people do. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Actually, Bilgi, since its inception, our university has been located in central yet neglected areas of the town. Okay, so what a university can do, basically, if you consider it in quote-unquote modern terms, it's this curricula. So you can try teaching social incubation, social innovation, if you like. But that's not enough, and that's not your real function. So university is not a place where you unilaterally try to teach things to people, but it's an exchange where you can create value for everyone involved, which means your neighbors. So we started supplying legal counseling services to the neighborhood, then psychological counseling services to our neighborhood, then scholarships. So that's one part of that. Then we have our social innovation division, which is creating projects with some partners and collaborators. And we're part of the advocacy community in Turkey in terms of social innovation. And of course, the students. Actually, it's really nonsense to teach the skills. I wouldn't say nonsense, but really insufficient to try to teach skills, but rather create kind of a Kindle in them so that they can look at the world and with a critical thinking perspective and having an objective judgment, empathy, and courage to change things. So we see an example here. Thank you. Hopefully we'll be meeting you in our university too one day. But this is what we're aiming to do. And perhaps one thing that I should take from where he left, when it comes to values, and when we say value and try to convert it to a unit, this unit is most of the time, money. So, and money or financial expressions actually are based mostly on tangible elements. They have been so, at least until the end of the 20th century. But now it's changing very fast. So intangible is the new tangible now. So stories, again, are the most essential parts of our intangibles. And when you look at the tangibles, they are actually, here we are. Actually, they are materialized forms of ideas. So they mostly belong to the past. And they are very much influenced and impacted by the changes in the macroeconomic environment. So as their value fluctuates, they become very intangible. On the other hand, when you have an idea which is related to the future, they can become even more stronger than your tangible assets. So in accounting sphere also, we need to make some changes to promote that idea. This is how I see it.
Thanks, Ecmel. I'm going to give you each 20 seconds to comment on each other's points or give a final thought that's not too unrelated. So 20 seconds each, final thought or comment, or even a question. Actually, no questions. I don't want any more questions. Just a comment on each other's points.
I'll just make it simple. I think that was brilliant.
Wonderful.
But I would say 2 books in the spirit of the last panel. Nordic Secret by Thomas Berkman, who talks about Volksschools and the rise of a new schooling model in the 19th century, which is fundamental to the Nordic and the Scandic transformations. Really interesting. And the other one is actually Jeff's colleague, Steen Westlake, on the capitalism without capital, right? Which talks about intangible accounting and why that's really key. So those two books are really brilliant, and I'd recommend them.
Great, thanks. That's after you've read Jeff's book, read Ella's article, and watched Interstellar.
Yeah. Okay. And I would recommend another book, which
Excellent.
Which apparently has no link whatsoever, but this is called Tao of the Pooh. It's linking, I don't know if you ever heard of that, it's linking this Taoistic and approach with Winnie the Pooh stories. And it's a wonderful one for readers of all ages and of all interests, so that's my recommendation. It's
Wonderful.
to what you're discussing.
My book's not yet out.
Yeah.
With that, when we ask Indy and Ecmel to stand up and give them a round of applause, we have one final speaker for you, which Yekta is going to come back and introduce. But as they stand up, you stand up as well. Give yourself a stretch, stand up, say hello to the person next to you, and sit yourself back down as you give Indy and Ecmel a big round of applause. Thank you so much.